Welcome to the second in our series of events on culture, conflict and recovery in Asia. We began this series in December with Rory Stewart. If you missed it, a recording is available on our YouTube channel. Today we focus on Iraq, which is beset by a host of social and political challenges. Foremost amongst these is mass population displacement, creating a major barrier to local and national reconstruction. As displaced communities return to their homes, tensions between local political factions, former IS fighters, and local communities run high. Moe Saito from the International Organization for Migration is talking about the role of sports and the arts in bridging community divisions in Iraq. She's a specialist in post-conflict and post-disaster development, vocational training and employment, and she worked on public-private partnerships, small and medium-sized enterprise development and finance schemes with Nippon Koei in the Philippines and Mongolia. From 2016 to 2019, she was with the International Labour Organization, and since 2019, she has been with the IOM. Joining her in the discussion will be Jonathan Rider from Aleph Strategies, architect of this series. I'm delighted to welcome both.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate that. My name is Moe, working in Iraq as a program coordinator of Peace Building and Stabilization Division of IOM, International Organization of Migrations. Let me start with a bit of the comments on the start. I today will present IOM activities and the work. However, I am not necessarily representing IOM views or status or positions. So please, if you can take note on that, that would be very appreciated. Let me start with what you may think about Iraq. Some of you might have been in Iraq, some of them not necessarily yet. So when I talk to friends about Iraq, most of the people have some image of the conflict, wars, destructions, as you may see in the photos. But when I came to Iraq for the first time 2 years ago or 3 years ago, this is what I saw, with very rich culture, rich nature and buildings. In the city that I am in Erbil, is a very big developing city with a lot of constructions, a lot of tall buildings. We also had very nice fireworks for the new year. We also have a lot of mountains, not always desert that someone may think, but a lot of green areas after the rainy season. And also we have some snow in winter. So this is my image that I saw in Iraq. So this, I hope you also take it of the rich nature, rich culture, and the rich in any of the aspects in Iraq beyond what we see in the news and conflicts and wars. If I can start from the very sort of basic context in Iraq. Apologies, this is a very simplified version, because if we start talking about histories and the context in Iraq, there are a lot of hundreds of ways to understand, and we may not necessarily think what is right and what's in particular where we are starting the history. That's also very political decisions. So this is really only for the practical purpose. So as you may know, after the Iraqi war and also US completed troop pull-out, some of the instabilities happened around 2013. And then, as we all know, that ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq, and the Levant seized Iraqi cities, including Mosul and any other areas. So this is quite a huge sort of the hot topics on the international news. The invasion really happened, the cities were taken, and a lot of instabilities happened. And then afterwards, other Iraqi government, Iraqi militaries, and other supported armed groups came in to retake the territories. And that's where in 2017, Prime Minister at that time declared victory over ISIL. Over the course of the occupations by ISIL and also retake by the government of Iraq and their supporters, there was a lot of displacements happened. At the time that occupation happened, there was a one wave that people fled from the areas, whereas some other people stayed there for various reasons. And then when there is also another violence or the conflicts happen to retake the area by the government of Iraq and their supporters, and there was also another displacement happened. And the returnees also coming along after 2018 or a little bit before that it's reversed. However, there are a lot of issues that we cannot see from this. One of them is that when people are considered as returnees on the data, they may still be in displacement, as we consider as secondary displacement, meaning that they cannot go to the area of origins, but they are in another cities. Maybe they are not in the camps or IDP camps, but they are still displaced in other areas. So this is also something we also see. The legacy of conflicts is also some of the parts that we still see in the day-to-day life in Iraq. If I can just bring two examples, one is that what we call as person with perceived affiliation to ISIL. This means the family members who had brother or fathers, other members who joined ISIL, but themselves are not an ISIL member at all. So themselves did nothing, but they have a family member who joined ISIL. That's why, because of the certain situation here, they also see discriminations, stigmatization because of being a family member of former ISIL members. Also, we see a lot of sectarian divisions connected to politics or military or any security matters or subjects. In particular, for example, for the northern parts of Iraq, where ISIL occupied once, and then the ISIL sometimes seems that particular ethno-religious groups are connected, which is not necessarily true, but when people see the sectarian divisions and a lot of people in ISIL previously have certain ethno-religious backgrounds, people may be judged because of being the same ethno-religious backgrounds or any other reasons that people are suspected to be ISIL members or former ISIL members. So those doubts and all the stigmatizations happens still in Iraq day to day. From here, what we as IOM is doing. So IOM, the International Organization for Migration, is one of the UN agencies. You may see the migration, so you might consider that we support migrants, and which is true. However, we also do a lot of diverse support outside of the migrants or migration issues. More in detail, for example, any of the displacements or any of the movements, that's what we consider as important work for IOM. So we consider the decent movement of people is our mission, and we support, for example, in Iraq, anyone who are displaced, anyone returning to the area of origins, anyone in secondary displacement, or anyone of the host communities that they themselves may not be moving, but they are living with someone who are displaced or returning. So that's also our concerns and the area of support. In the programming in IOM, this is only part of our support, but in Iraq, we have some diversity of the work and programs, which considers as part of it as a recovery and transitions, meaning that we support people in the camps or returning from the camps, also some economical and livelihoods recovery from the conflicts. some other security and community policing that we also work with police or other security actors. We also work with protections and MHPSS, which is mental health and psychosocial support, considering very important after the conflict, displacement, a lot of violence still happens. And then legal and house, land and property support, HLP. This is also quite important that people leaving the house, and then when they return, sometimes those houses are taken by someone else, and how they're reclaiming, or if their houses are destroyed by the conflict, what will be the compensations, all those sort of the works that we are doing. And then finally, among others, social cohesion and community stabilizations. This is quite a lot directly addressing the problems, how people of perceived affiliation to ISIL and other people can live together without violence. And also how we see that the root causes of the discriminations and violence, how we can address it for the long-term sustainable peace, if we could say, or at least for the community stabilizations. Among that, those we also consider a lot for the culture, and culture we say sports and arts, and among others. This is quite important for the social cohesions and community stabilizations. Although we do have a lot of humanitarian support, and also the livelihoods and economic recovery is very important. We see that's not necessarily enough to really working for the community stabilizations. And if we want to make the effective community stabilizations, culture really comes in, and it really helps us as well to do the programming for that purpose. For the overall sort of the culture as how it's fit in our programming, is that the very basic part is that the support of the mental health and psychosocial supports, meaning that when we talk about MHPSS, there is often some misunderstanding or some doubts about MHPSS, that maybe in many countries, people still see that MHPSS is something very strange or very different, that it's very difficult sometimes for people to consult on MHPSS at their needs, or when their family members have some needs of MHPSS, it's very difficult to directly contact on that. So for that, we use culture, how people can come and do some cultural activities. And that is sort of an entry point, how people learn, how people talk each other, how people know IOM services, and then it gets to more the details of the MHPSS services in more comfortable and safe manner. We also see culture as the entry to the community. If we really bring very sensitive topics in the beginning to the communities, people may not accept the idea, may not necessarily understand what is IOM, what is the programming, and they may not, welcoming the interventions and supports that IOM may be able to provide. In that point, culture is something that no one's really against. Also, however, the backgrounds are different with religion, ethnicity, and anything else. People often share culture in terms that, many people like football in Iraq, many people like sewing, handcrafts. So this is really an entry activity that we can do with communities, and then we can introduce ourselves to the community and how people can learn what the IOM is, and how they can decide if they want to trust IOM or not through those easy but also shared cultural activities. In addition, we use the culture to build social cohesion, to reduce tensions within communities. Even when communities accept us and then IOM do the activities, cultures are still with us in the ways that, for example, when we like to do the dialogue, We do not necessarily go jump into these stories and discussions, but if we have some cultural activities, that's also when people can talk each other, even if they're not necessarily doing beforehand. You know, they see your culture, they can take it like that. Based on that, let me share 3 examples of how we used the mental health, the culture for the mental health, community stabilizations, and other social cohesions. You know, for certain women, leaving their house is really the first challenge. When we say that we have a curving class in IOM or drawing class in IOM, it is a lot easier for them to come out from home. Their family often supports those cultural activities, and then that would be also an entry point that they can discuss more of the primary other needs of the people. Also, for the social cohesion with community engagement, once, for example, we had food and sports for social cohesion activities, that was a Nineveh governorate that said that people or young people had their own football teams in the local communities, but because of the neighborhoods where sometimes it's more concentrated on the particular ethno-religious backgrounds, they had more the isolated team that they do not necessarily interact with other groups of people with different ethno-religious backgrounds. And seeing that a bit of the tensions because of political and the historical reasons, we asked young people, the football teams, if they'd be interested to have a tournament among the different teams in the location. In this way of doing, we asked them if they want to have a new team, mixing different team members. So they have a new team on that day, which is mixed of the ethno-religious backgrounds, and they work together and compete for the footballs. And then the winners, the 2 winners, prepared food themselves, and then also sort of the award for them. But the food preparation was also done together with different members. And this is how we would like to encourage young people to interact each other, and also they work for a common goal when they are with different ethno-religious backgrounds. And this is really possible because we use sports here, because sports is something, you know, it's never be harmful for anyone. Really, a lot of people like football. Community people also come to see the tournaments, so it's also a really good symbolic event for the communities that people, regardless of their backgrounds, working and playing the football together and cooking the food. Another one that I like to bring is a particular game board, the game boards that we have in Iraq. So the photos that we have here at the right, this is the, we call as Game of Yule. It was created about 2600 BC. So it's very historical game boards, maybe oldest in the world as a game board. And it was also spread a lot in the Middle East area. However, the game was forgotten at one point in the history, and not many people in Iraq knew about this game board. But one of the diaspora from Iraq living in London right now saw this game board in the British Museum and thought how they can bring this game board back to Iraq. So this is how the actions happens. We got a lot of talented carpenters, drawers to make this game board. And also we are creating how to play and how people can do as part of the social cohesion work, meaning that, you know, by playing the game board together, they can discuss, they can also share their culture, what they think about their history. Also for making the game board, this is also linked to the livelihood support that we are wishing to support. someone with the skills making some livings by making this game boards. This is very new in the market, so hoping that it may be quite interesting when the Iraqi people started to share the stories and started to share how it's made and the histories backgrounds on that. So those are quite some of the parts that we do for the culture, for the social cohesion activities. The last drawing here as well is coming from our beneficiaries. Often we have a little bit more tragedy related drawing, but this one is really showing some hope, how culture can also support people, looking some of the hopes and how the Iraq and people in Iraq can see the future with their culture and better future as they wish to have. So thank you so much. Let me stop here and then get back to you, the facilitator. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much indeed for that presentation. That was a really interesting overview of the work of IOM and this culture program. I've got a number of questions that I thought I would kick the discussion off with. For us, it's been really exciting to have you as part of this series because the IOM is known for a range of different activities. You presented many of them on one of your slides. But this feels like a very innovative, very exciting and very interesting program for an organization like IOM to be looking at sport and culture rather than the sort of traditional support mechanisms in a humanitarian crisis. Could you just give us a bit of context as to how this program came about and why you decided that sport and art would be a useful way or an effective way to work with local communities?
Sure, thank you. So really, I think for when we start from the humanitarian phases, when the conflict was still ongoing or just ending, there are a lot of more the direct support, food, health, those very basic needs that people are needed for living. But then when we came to the stage that when we need some community stabilizations, that okay, maybe people are living, but then they are still in unstable situation. They're not very comfortable because of the security situation, etc. We wanted to address certain root causes of the conflict stabilizations or instabilization, I would say. There, we really discussed a lot with the Iraqi colleagues and other people, the community people, the authorities, and anyone else, that the topics are very sensitive, or you may know very well that the Iraq is the history of a lot of conflict, different dynamics. It's really, really sensitive to bring any details, topics, to bring it to the communities or the groups of people. Whereas maybe some other easier contact points, that's something really needed. So our colleagues, like Iraqi colleagues, really suggested us that we really can't bring the very sensitive topics to the communities right away. If we do that, we'll really clash the trust and we can't be doing anything and we'll make people very upset. So we have to find a way how we can really address those issues by not making people uncomfortable. And that was really culture, arts and sports. Something that people really share, something that people do not necessarily have a political view on it, that we can bring it on the table, people can enjoy it. So without bringing very sensitive topics in the beginning, people can start to talk, discuss together, and that's really how we can do it. So in the way that we can be very sensitive, we consider conflict sensitivities. We can't really ignore culture, because without that, then we will really inappropriate for doing anything in the conflict situations.
I think it's really interesting. And is this something that IOM has been doing in Iraq for a while? And is this something, the arts and sports specifically, that you do in other countries as well?
Yes, I think so. So it really depends on the spaces. When there is a very, very humanitarian visit, I think the direct culture involved is a little bit limited. Although there are always some considerations, you know, for what people are eating or what kind of the language, what kind of the gesture we'll be using, it's still there. But I think when it comes to the transitions, culture becomes more important. So I think for Iraq, it's getting a little bit more important in the past 2-3 years, more than before, because of the transitions period that we are facing in Iraq.
And what do you see as the sort of the long-term outlook for a program of this nature? I mean, could you just give us a sense of scale within the IOM portfolio in Iraq? Is this a small part of a very big program? Is it a small standalone exercise? Is it very large? And do you have plans, given that transition from an immediate humanitarian disaster to a more development context? You know, are there plans for scaling this further?
Right. So I think the volume is really shifting from we started very small activities in the beginning, which is growing day to day and year to year. Even today, we got a new proposal discussing a little bit more culture, very dynamic sort of history, culture sort of things. So IOM and also people here really see a bit of the transitions, really, that how we want to continue for the sustainability. And it's quite a moment that the approach are changing, the strategies are changing from the more humanitarian to the development and more the sustainability of these stabilizations. So that way, I think, you know, it's really growing, and I'm pretty sure that the culture will be a little bit more everywhere in our programming in coming months and years.
Well, then let me ask the $1 million question, I suppose, as far as I think particularly funders of this type of program are concerned. You know, you've mentioned that you're seeing some early results here, but how do you measure the impact of these kinds of programs, and how are you selling this to other potential funders in the future?
Right. So what's good really about the culture and arts and sports is that we really get some very positive testimonies, a lot of stories from that. In terms of, for example, when we have even a very small project, we get a lot of people sharing their testimonies, how they felt in the beginning, very stressed, very difficult to talk to people, whereas you know, over the course of the work, people are more comfortable to getting that, and that really leads to a little bit more concrete outcomes. For example, people getting jobs, or people getting joining the music professional groups, or you know, anything on those things. So it's really great to see the stories and the people sharing those. So that's something we can consider as quite a appealing points on that. In terms of the strategies, I think we are really considering how it really fits in Iraq, because it's really important that when we talk about culture, it's a culture of people here. So it's very critical that myself, for example, is from outside of Iraq. So a lot to learn, and many donors also outside of Iraq. Then you know, a lot of sort of knowledge, ideas coming from Iraq, and that's what we really value as well. That ideas, proposals really coming from Iraqi people, so that we don't miss out on what they think as culture of their culture.
I guess you can probably guess where I'm going with my questions here. I'd love to know a little bit about, you know, how this compares to other of IOM's programs. Are you seeing, because you're working with culture, or to what extent, I should say, are you seeing different results because you're working with culture compared to other forms of programming?
Right. To be honest, when we think about social cohesions, well, sometimes the culture is more the large parts or the direct activity components, whereas maybe even other programmings that we don't necessarily consider as culture as the program part, it's always there. So I would actually doubt that we have any programs that we do not necessarily consider culture at all. So it's like really there. If we think that, for example, for the game of Yore, something that we really address culture as the part of the activity, I see that, well, I guess it's quite interesting that it connects people in the way that we started from Mosul, but then we also get some interest from Erbil, which is in the, you know, different locations, different culture, but also they are still interested in that. And we also get the diaspora. So a lot of the, you know, modern connections, you know, we often get a lot of attentions and interest from different locations in Iraq and in other countries. So that's something I think feel important and a value of culture that, you know, it really gets the attention of people rather than the very standard operations that we do.
Just changing tack for a moment. One of the questions from somebody listening remotely here is, you know, could you tell us a little bit more about the composition of the people that you work with, the minority groups that you're working with, and just tell us sort of how they're included and what your sort of strategy around that is.
Right, so it really depends on the programming and also the locations. If I can go for the northern part of Iraq where I am covering, which is Ninawa Governorate, where the ISIL occupied it one time. So we do, we have people that we work with as, well, maybe the Arabs, yes, Arabs see as Sunnis. And also we have a Turkmen, which is the minority groups in Iraq. We also have Christians. We also have Shabak. We also have Yazidis. So, I mean, maybe if I start naming them, I might be continuing 1 hour. So I'll stop here. But there are a lot of minority groups. And also, it's interesting that, for example, in Tel Afar, the Turkmen are the majority in the population. So Turkmen are minority in Iraq, but the majority in Tel Afar. So the very different dynamics are there. So we see how it is important for us to make sure that people are gathering together, meaning that in Tel Afar, for example, we do not necessarily consider, okay, we have to have a Turkmen, but then we also think, okay, we need to include or encourage Arab and Kurds people to come together. We also consider the Sunnis and Shias are also joining together. So it's really the location-wise. This is for Tel Afar Center. If we go for the another sub-district, which is still in Tel Afar district, the dynamics is very different. So we consider the very localized situations so that we consider and also make sure the diversity in our groups is always there.
I'll just come in there, if I may, very briefly. The question that Jonathan just put, it came from Gillian Dare from the organization Mosaic Middle East, and incidentally, Chris Seeger, who is also a member of the board of Mosaic Middle East, is also online. They're both, as it happens, former colleagues of mine. But for the audience as a whole, Mosaic Middle East does quite a lot of work in very similar areas to the IOM on this, and I've just posted their website details in the chat channel if you would like to follow that up. And if I may, Jonathan, without stealing your thunder while I'm here, pose the question that Chris Seeger has asked, which ought to be, I guess, simple to answer. He just asks, what approximately is your annual budget at IOM in Iraq?
I am not sure if I'm allowed to share that. If maybe I can just bring a little bit links, and you might also find it in any of our websites. So if that's there, that's fine. That you can find it. But maybe as like approximate, sort of the image is that we often have the smaller project, which can be $10,000. Maybe most of the projects are 2 million, 4 million, 6 million. That's sort of the, the project that we often see. Whereas we also see a lot for the 10 million, 20 million. That's also sort of the cases that we also see. So it really depends. And I think I would say for the culture related activities for the social cohesions, I really like that because it's very cost efficient. Even if certain donors have only $100,000, it's quite a lot what we can do for culture. Whereas if we consider infrastructure work, it might not be enough, but for culture, sports and arts, that's something we can really start from the smaller ones until the larger one, of course. So that's something we are working on.
I'm glad you asked that question, Michael, and not me. I always feel awkward asking people about their budgets. So thank you. Something very interesting that you mentioned was the, again and again, the sensitivity of engaging with communities in this kind of an environment. And culture obviously proverbially has the capacity to divide as well as to unite. And so I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you went about identifying the elements of culture that you wanted to engage with, that you felt would bring people together, rather than those elements that might provoke differences between communities.
Right. So I think in most of the programmings, what we do for the first time is that we ask people to come together and then share their thoughts. We do the focus group discussions, as you may often hear. Well, it really depends. Sometimes we get a little bit more comfortable small group that we separate to women or men or other gender, or the similar age or similar neighborhoods, so that people are very comfortable sharing their thoughts, and we get good ideas from them. Really, so they're really people living in the community, so they know their culture or other sensitive issues, and that's where we get a lot of ideas. And how afterwards our staff, who are also from the locations often and also speak the language of the people, get the ideas together, and that's sort of the basis how we want to develop a proposal or programming based on that. So really hearing the ideas of people is our strategy.
And have you noticed any sort of different levels of interest in various activities? Which are the most popular?
Well, I have to say football. I mean, no one really dislikes football, if I can exaggerate, right? So I think when we had the football tournaments in Tel Afar, that's also Tel Afar. Sorry, I'm covering Tel Afar, so a lot of stories coming from Tel Afar, but among others, it was really the moments that people were really excited. That's sort of the energies that we felt from the people.
You mentioned, of course, the funding elements, and just to come back to that momentarily. So you often find yourself pitching for this type of work for more funding. How are donors responding to the kind of the culture angle when you approach them as IOM? We're doing migration, but also we're actually using culture and arts. How's that landing?
Right. So you mean how the data is showing the cultural involvement, right?
Well, more how the donors themselves take it when you tell them, we'd like to do this program with your money, and we're going to be doing it in these atypical ways, using culture rather than other forms of programming that you might know us for. We're doing this exciting new thing. How are they responding to that?
Right. So it really depends how we also, try to learn the interest and the you know, what the interesting parts for the donors as well, so that we can also contribute to their areas of interest. When we talk about culture, this really depends. Some donors are really open, that, you know, they accept the social cohesion as a component. And then when we propose some cultural aspects to it, they really welcome, and then we can go for it. Often though, we see a lot of the interest based on more the direct, something directly connected to instabilizations, meaning that, for example, if we would be addressing the involvement or engagement of people with perceived affiliation to ISIL, or if we are talking about prevention of violent extremism. So those like a bigger framework are quite interesting, I guess, for many donors and also for different actors. So that's always often gets to the entry points. We in the categories of IOM, culture is sort of the more the mainstreamed approach. So there's no particular sort of idea that, okay, let's get the one project on culture, but rather culture is spread all across the project. So even if we are talking about PVE, then the culture may be also there because of the more effective approach on the PVE. So that's more on that as far as I see so far.
I'd just like to come in, if I may, there with a question that builds a bit on what Jonathan was asking about. Obviously, the response of donors is very important, but a two-part question here, I suppose. One is, how have you found other agencies reacting to IOM's involvement in this area? I mean, does UNESCO, for example, feel that it's their patch, or is there collaboration within the UN community on this? And secondly, to what extent have you been able, particularly in the sports area, to get national organizations from donor countries involved? I think, for example, of Afghanistan, where I worked myself for a number of years. And Afghanistan didn't play cricket until the civil war started, but so many learned cricket in the refugee camps in Pakistan that it really took off after 2001. And there was a great deal of support given by the English Cricket Board, for example, and other organizations. I wonder if you'd had much success on those sorts of channels.
Thank you. For the first questions, I think IOM and also other UN agencies are collaborating and communicating quite well in Iraq. In terms of the coordination, we still have a cluster, that cluster of protection or cluster of livelihoods. You know, for the sector-based cluster is also a way that we communicate. In Mosul, I think UNESCO worked on the rehabilitation of some cultural assets, whereas we also work for some other more soft components of the culture. And we never really get any confrontations. I think we do support, we share, document each other, and then, you know, we encourage each other for the engagement of culture or anything that's really important. So to the extent I can see, I feel that UN agencies and other actors are really seeing what's needed in the communities and what are the needs of the people without much of the competition. So, you know, it doesn't mean that IOM is not a cultural organization, but no one criticizes us. And it's more, I feel, it's encouraged and welcomed by other agencies as well. For the second questions, I think we haven't really get to the points that, you know, we are working for the national teams or anything a little bit bigger. The culture for us has been sort of the points that we engage with communities. So a lot really happening with the communities, and very much in the individual levels, household levels, and the community levels. I do wish though, I think in particular when we talk about the game of Yule, we had some dreams from the Iraqi colleagues and the diaspora that they want to make it as a national tournament, which might be very interesting. So we do have some ideas and hopes that we can get into more the larger approach on that.
Well, I'm very conscious of the time, but if I may, I have one more question here, which is about some of the challenges and obstacles that you have faced in our line of work. Often when we sort of pitch cultural angles or cultural programs, we might be met with rather confused faces or a bit of prejudice, a bit of pushback. We don't want to give money for that kind of thing. Can you share some experiences on that front? Maybe the kind of obstacles you faced and the ways that you've overcome those, or batted aside any concerns about why invest in culture. It's helpful to arm ourselves with these arguments collectively, I think.
I think, you know, often or sometimes the interest of funding goes more for the humanitarians. I think it's changing nowadays, but then it's still there. So when there's a disaster, when there's a conflict, when there is a very tragic incident, the attentions of the international actors goes there. When there's a cultural things losing, it doesn't seem like a very big event to the international audience, that it gets missed out sometimes. So we see that a lot, not only in Iraq perhaps, but it's very difficult. Maybe in the humanitarian phases, there's a lot of support, which gets a little bit smaller when it gets to the transitions where culture becomes a little bit more important. And then we also get to another phase of the sustainability and development, etc. So, you know, it's something that's a little bit difficult, how we get the attentions of people. I think it's still very difficult for people. I met a person from Mosul today and sharing that the Mosul before the conflict and now is very different, and very different because of how people are, you know, not necessarily engaged with the cultural activities, or you know, even talking on the streets, playing on the streets, going for bookstores, doing some cultural activities together. That's really changed, and you know, that's something that's very difficult for the person who shared today. So it's really something that's important. It's quite a core of personal feelings, and that's related to the instabilities and community challenges. So the importance is there, but it's a little bit difficult to see that, I would say. So I hope that, you know, those transitions with culture can see it. And I think it's very important, because if we consider the prevention of another conflict, now is the time to work on. When it's the transition, then that's really important. And if we want to do it very well, then that's also culture and people. So I hope that we get a little bit more attention, and I hope that we can also try to show it better, so that we get a little bit more support on that.
Thank you, and I think that's very much the sort of the collective mission of this lecture series. So I look forward to exchanging notes over the coming months. I think we've got time for one final, very specific question here about whether IOM engages in language training or long-term skills training.
So yes, we do. It's also part of culture, social cohesions. We have different type of the language related activities. One for the writing and reading in Arabic speaking regions. That sometimes, for example, parents cannot write and read, and it's very difficult to follow the school's letters, and that's also difficult to help their children to learn, and that's creates some isolations, and it's quite a big problem in certain communities. So we do have the language literacy courses in Arabic. Also, we had some language, more the poems or storytelling style that certain people who are very experienced share their poems, how to make it, so more the literature, poem, artistic type of the language as well. We also had English courses as well, which is quite attractive to young people in certain areas and certain people. And you know, it's also quite interactive, how they can read in English about Iraq, or any news, any stories that they see on the line on internet. We also support them learning in English on that. So yeah, I think that's that.
Well, a very, very big thank you from me. I'll hand over to Michael now, but thank you enormously for really kicking off this series with a really exciting perspective from the ground in a really exciting context. So thank you very much from me.
Indeed, and thank you from me too, not least for sticking with it despite the technological difficulties. It's actually one of the marvelous things about doing things online is that we can have speakers like you from very distant places instead of only people who happen to be in London at the right time. But of course, one then runs a risk as far as the technology is concerned. It's only ever let us down twice, and you were unfortunate, but thank you nevertheless. Our next event will be on the 16th of February, when we have a distinguished panel of experts discussing Chinese government policy in Xinjiang. The next event in this series will be on the 2nd of March, when Rudy von Planter from the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation will be our guest. The Swiss agency is unique among development agencies in requiring all of their programs to incorporate elements relating to the cultural context of their work. So I hope that you will find that interesting as well, and that we will see you at one or both of those events. For now, thank you again to Moe Saito and to Jonathan Rider, and thank you to our audience. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.